So now I mentioned the turning point around 1500 BCE. The Assyrians that conquered Mesopotamia, they came from the north, and they went into conflict with the New Kingdom Egyptian Empire. They fight in this area. Sometimes this became Assyrian, sometimes this area became kind of Egyptian. So this is an imperialistic age since the mid second millennium BCE. The architectural decoration showed the different character of the culture. Now we have these images showing the sacking of a city or beheading captives, those corpses floating in blood, and those fighting and killing. A lot of those images start to appear from the Assyrian period. So their palace walls were covered with sculptures glorifying military might. And it is at this moment we start to observe in architecture the shifting relationship between the king and the priest. So the temple palace complex formed the center of the city-state, and monopolizing all means of production, reducing the population into dependence. So there is a greater autocratic control, monopoly on the state business by the king. And in time, kings amass power at the expense of the priest by encouraging market economy to diminish the economic power of the temple. We mentioned before that the temple was a very important economic center because it managed the storage. And now the king starts to take that power from the priest. And as a result, gradually the power concentrated in the hand of the king. So due to the rising militarism, the priest king gives way for the warrior king. And previously, like the priest, the king was also a servant to the god. But now, since the Assyrian period, some of the king would directly, almost deify themselves. Similar things happened in Egypt. The New Kingdom pharaohs gradually would call themselves the god, identify themselves with God, as if they were reincarnation of sun god. And in Mesopotamia, the supreme god was the moon god. So the royal palace, we can observe in that royal palace substitute the temple as the center of power. For example, here at Nimrod, this is the central palace, and it got its own headquarters. It got its own enclosure. This is like the service to the palace, and the palace itself can be divided into three parts. The central part has no business with the ziggurat. The ziggurat is on the side, and that is the temple part. The central part is the palatial part. So the king's palace, in terms of its size, in terms of its location, overpower the ziggurat, which is now a pendant to the palatial complex. The Assyrian capitals were constructed in very similar fashion. For example, this is Khorsabad. The previous one is Nimrod, but they look very similar. So at Khorsabad, the royal city of Sargon, and this is the second Sargon, not the Akkadian Sargon. This is Assyrian Sargon. He planned this city and the city had, the big city in general, and the headquarters is attached to one side of the city wall, and then the palace is sitting astride the interior and the exterior of the city. So, and along the central axis is the palace, and now the ziggurat is attached to one side, and that is the temple. So temple became a framing accompaniment to the palace, and there is not even a huge ground to allow large gathering. It is basically a temple, serving the royal family. And the city itself was designed to glorify the military spirit and the military power of the king. Huge staircases allows the chariot to move directly from the avenue to the platform of the city headquarters. And there was also parading street in the city for the military kind of a parading and a demonstration. So this is obviously a very different model compared to the city of Ur. This is our old friend, city of Ur, from 2100 BCE. And this is the city of Khorsabad from the 8th century BCE. This is the kind of Sumerian city, and here we have the Assyrian city. I call them one the heart model and another the head model. The heart model has the headquarters fully enclosed by the city at large, while the head model had its headquarters, attached to one side. There are pros and cons for, for both cases. If we got class time, I usually would have a discussion here, but I'm going to basically summarize the pros and cons here. In general, to my opinion, the heart model was used for cities where the rulers had good relationship with the subjects, because that means, those additional layers added protection to the ruler instead of threat, right? Usually for those more kind of military regime, and very often, sometimes the threat, instead of coming from outside invasion, might be just come from the revolt of its own people. And in this case, the head model is more preferable, because that means the ruler would not be, enclosed by the uprising people from within. So it has the advantage of, going directly to the suburb. And we will look at a lot of city in this class later, and keep this in mind and tell me whether it is head model or the heart model, the two kind of popular city models in the from the ancient time. The ziggurat at Khorsabad is has 7 layers of platform, but different from the previous ziggurat. Here, the top of the of each layer continued. So we have a spiral surface which allows the chariot to move directly from the ground all the way to the top. So in another word, the roof of these platforms, they are connected into a sloping continuity that allows traveling, spiraling directly to the top. So in another word, now this is not necessarily for those grand kind of demonstration of power. It is a more private temple that the king didn't even bother to go through a central monumental staircase. He just ride his chariot, move to the top to have a more private encounterance with the god for whom he is representing. So we find in architecture and also in the style of governance, there is a more kind of identification between the rulers and their god. Indeed, the priest class now is entirely under a disadvantaged relationship in their relationship to the king. Another thing I wanted to point out is that in Mesopotamia, their cities above ground were constructed mostly with mud brick and using post and lintel structure. But for their underground tunnels, they use arches and vaults, and they also use kind of fired bricks. So the arches and the vaults were invented long before the Romans, even though it is the Romans who demonstrate the great performance of these structural systems to create those huge baths and theater, etc. But arches and vaults existed long before the Romans, but for some reason, they were not used to glorify the city, but used to construct underground tunnels, not used for roofing system. I think I'm going to just briefly mention this. We won't be able to cover Persepolis, so we will leave Persepolis to next time, and we will have a little bit left over. But briefly mention this example, the Ishtar Gate. I mentioned that Ishtar is the goddess of war, sex, and fertility for the Babylonians. The new Babylonians revived in the Neo-Babylonian Empire revived in the 7th century BCE. And their city is of course, for the Babylonian Empire, the capital city is no longer in the Khorsabad or the Sargon city, but in the city of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar totally reconstructed the city of Babylon, and today the archaeological recovered Babylon is not from 18th century BCE, but from the 7th century BCE. It belonged to the New Babylon, the Neo-Babylon city. So this city is very well preserved in archaeological site. And we know the city had those military features of the earlier Assyrian city, featuring big avenues for military parade. And along those parading streets, there were monumental gate. These monumental gates are known as a pylon, and we will look at more pylon in the Egyptian civilization. Pylon. So there are pure monumental, just for the parade, looks framed nicely, framed monumentally, and the street connected to it has a military spirit as well. It's called "May the Enemy Not Have Victory." That's the name of that street, and the Nebuchadnezzar's New Babylon city was partially restored by Saddam Hussein. You guys still know who Saddam Hussein is? The former, Iraqi dictator, overthrown by George W. Bush. So he actually in the 1980s reconstructed that. He would like to compare himself as the great Nebuchadnezzar, as if Nebuchadnezzar brought glory to Babylon almost 3,000 years ago, and now Saddam Hussein was doing it for Iraq today. We know that he failed, but he left this kind of reconstructed city of Babylon, and this is partially restored by Saddam Hussein on the same archaeological site. While in the soil of Iraq today, all those are fakes. We can say these are not real antique. The real thing is in Berlin. So this is the fake in Iraq. The real, 2,600-year-old tiles are in Berlin, in the Pergamon Museum. So next time when you go to Berlin, you should visit the Pergamon Museum. There you will see the real Ishtar Gate. So it was brought to Germany by Frederick the Great in the 19th century, and installed in the island, in the center, in the river of Berlin, and that Pergamon Museum. So that's the real thing, and it's the monumental start for the parading street for the New Babylon. It has military appearance. It basically looks like a castle with those parapets, and the images were the symbol of Ishtar, the dragon, symbolize Ishtar, the goddess of war, and the city deity Marduk as well, to protect the city from exterior invasion. So we are going to stop here, and thank you so much for your patience. And I'm going to first stop this.